Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. What's up, Lance?
How is it going, Tim?
It's going great, Lance. I am excited that warmer weather is here, and I just want to tell the whole world about it.
Well, something else that we get the opportunity to tell the world about is, in fact, the subject matter of this episode. We speak about the disappearance of Barbara Louise Cotton. She was 15 years old. She disappeared from Williston, North Dakota on April 11th, 1981. And we speak with the host of the exceptional podcast, Dakota Spotlight.
Yes, his name's James Wolner. Great guy, really dedicated to this missing persons case. And he's done about 5 seasons on his show, Dakota Spotlight. You can check out dakotaspotlight.com. It's kind of a great catch-all. You can obviously link to listen there as well. His podcast is interesting, and obviously we have some similar interests and experiences, Lance, having covered missing persons cases in depth for several years now. And so I hope you enjoy this interview. And if you have any information in the disappearance of Barbara Cotton, please contact the Williston Police Department at 701-577-1212.
And I just want to make a note here that James does this full time. So any way you can support him, listen to his show, rate his show, Dakota Spotlight. He left his full-time job to pursue this, and it really turned from a passion project to a full-time project for him. Also, just another example of a good member of this, citizen detective community trying to do the right thing and trying to help out families. And taking on trying to figure out what happened to Barbara Cotton is a challenging case to sort of initiate yourself with, and tip of the cap to James for doing that. Again, Dakota Spotlight. Listen, rate, subscribe, however you can support this gentleman.
Welcome to the podcast, James Wolner. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Talking to you from western North Dakota, where it snowed a couple days ago, and looks like we're going to have some warm weather coming up here soon. So, I live close to a train track, by the way, so this is not technically my studio. This is my office, so we might hear a train or a lawnmower before it's over.
Yeah, I think that adds some depth and some character to the episodes. So I welcome the train tracks. I welcome the train and the lawnmower. But you were not originally from North Dakota, which is an area that I've never been, and I've always wanted to go because it's just fascinating to me.
I grew up in Northern California, and in the wine country up there. And my parents did grow up out here in the Midwest in South Dakota. So we used to come out here in the summers, visit grandma, cousins, stuff like that. I graduated from college in California in 1990, studied English and photojournalism. And then I pretty much, on the day of graduation, packed up and moved to Europe, where I stayed for 21 years in the country of Sweden. I have grown daughters there today, and came back to the U.S. in 2012, and I relocated to Boulder, Colorado, only because cool place to live, right? So I was there for about 1.5 years working as a webmaster, and the company I was working for, it didn't look like we were going to last. It was going to maybe go bankrupt. I don't know. So I started looking for different work, and I just kind of thought, maybe I'll try something different. Found a really good developer job up in North Dakota, and now I'm here.
Well, quite a journey, a lot of traveling.
What was Sweden like?
Sweden. Oh, it was a really great place to live. When I moved there in 90, I was so ready to go, man. I moved to this capital of Stockholm, and after being a starving student for years, it took me a while to get through college, working part-time jobs, never knowing I was going to pay rent the next month. Health insurance. Well, in college we had health insurance, but, car payments. So I moved to Stockholm, with one suitcase, and it was so liberating, and, no longer needed a car because of public transportation, and didn't need health insurance because you don't need that there. You just have access to healthcare, right? So it was pretty much the first time in my life where I felt, wow, I can breathe a little bit for a while. And Sweden's a great, beautiful place. People are great. You know, it's different than the U.S. in some ways. People are a little more reserved and things like that. But a lot of good critical thinking going on over there. If we touch on that later, you know, one of the things I missed since moving back to the U.S. is being able to sit down with a group of friends to eat dinner. Obviously, during a pandemic, that didn't happen, but and sort of have a long discussion over 3-4 hours, or 3 hours, and have your differences of opinions and actually have some quality, how should I put this, critical thinking, discussions in a pretty much civil way without things getting real heated. And I kind of miss that.
That doesn't happen. Get out of here.
I mean, things could get heated at times, I'm sure, but I don't know. I mean, don't want to get political or anything, but we've been through some tough years recently, so in this country. So, yeah, Sweden's a great place. I hope to get back in September. Maybe I just talked to my daughter, and she hasn't been vaccinated yet, so I'm looking at September next time.
Very cool. Well, you have been digging into the disappearance of Barbara Louise Cotton for quite some time, and you've been doing a podcast too. Can you tell us a little bit about your deep dive into this disappearance case?
So I've been doing the podcast for a couple years for sure. Believe it or not, Barbara Cotton, I only started working on that in January of this year, but it's just really taken off. I mean, this community up in Williston, North Dakota, where she went missing, I've got so much support so quickly, especially my Facebook group. I wanted to start working on it a couple years ago. You're right there. I'd sent some interview requests to a retired detective, and he respectfully declined. Then I reached out to Williston PD. He suggested I reach out to Williston PD. Never really got any response there at all. And so I kind of dropped it, put it on the back burner. And I honestly went up to Williston, where Barbara went missing, in January, thinking this will probably be a 1-episode thing, right? And a little background, I guess. Barbara went missing on April 11th, 1981. So it was 40 years just recently. The story goes that she was walking home from a restaurant in downtown Williston and just never made it home. 5-block walk on a Saturday night. She's 15 years old, beautiful girl. And everyone I've spoken to says, friends and family, that she was just very kind and generous. And I don't believe it's one of those cliche things we hear in all the stories where, walked into the room and she lit up a room, and it becomes a cliche, right? So I'm kind of weary of even trusting those sources at first, but I gotta say, everything I've learned, she did really seem to be very kind, and perhaps to a fault, a little too trusting and forgiving, or I should say, trusting, maybe a little bit gullible even. So that might have eventually got her into trouble. We're not sure, but she's never been seen from or heard from again. And I went up to Williston thinking, here's maybe a 1-episode story. I'll try to find out what was her route home. And since then, it has just kind of taken off, because I'll tell you what I expected to find out up there. I expected after 40 years, I would expect the family to say, you know what, we're tired of talking about this, done already. We're so tired of the cops talking to us, and, we don't want to look at, 40 years is a long time. I expected one of those stories where all the leads had been worked out and saturated. But what I found out was that Barbara's siblings, who are in the podcast, have no recollection of ever being spoken to by law enforcement until about 1 or 2 years ago. Their childhood friend, Sandy, was never spoken to. And I've learned during this podcast, I did get an interview with one of the current day investigators. And if I understand this correctly, which I guess I do, the last person to see Barbara, a gentleman named Stacy Werder, was never interviewed by police ever. He's deceased today. He actually hung himself in jail 3 months later. And there's another person who was one of Barbara's friends who said she saw Barbara at a party that night. And I could not get it confirmed from present day law enforcement that she was ever spoken to, or the response I've gotten from them is, well, just because we don't have a record of it doesn't mean they weren't interviewed. And so it's created a lot of frustration. My podcast, looking into this, like I said, I was expecting this is going to be, no one's going to want to talk to me. The police are going to say, here, take a look at this if you want. We don't know what to do. I mean, I've had that happen to me. I've looked at a couple police files from Bismarck PD where they said, we've exhausted everything. You're welcome to look at this. It's open and ongoing. But instead, it's kind of like we suddenly have this situation where people are kind of not in an uproar, but there's a lot of frustrated listeners, people, including the friends and family of, especially the friends of Barbara Cotton, who are like, come on, was this really looked into? And present day investigators are trying, in the interview I had with the one investigator, said, we're not here to talk about mistakes that might have been made, which I guess is true to a certain point. But how do we get to the truth? How do we find out what could have been missed if we don't at least look at that? And I haven't rambled, but I've talked for a long time, so I'm going to stop.
No, okay. You've set up the story nicely for us. I've got several questions. First one, I guess, is how big is the Williston Police Department?
Well, let's see. They probably have, it's an oil, so this is in the oil country in northwestern North Dakota. So I think there's 28,000 people in Williston today. So it's one of the bigger cities in North Dakota. So the Williston Police Department is, appropriately the size for that size of town, whatever that would be.
It's 25,000 population today?
It's 28,000 today. Yeah, I think it was 13 when she went missing.
Oh, so it's definitely grown in the 40 years.
Yes.
And did you say something about it's like an oil town, an oil city?
People up there, they'd speak in terms of oil booms and oil crashes. So with the boom comes money, employers, employment, a lot of people from out of state, right, who maybe background checks weren't always really done correctly. Kind of like the Wild Wild West, the gold rush, right? You get prostitution, drugs, crime goes up, cost of living goes up. So the people, locals, they're on the fence a little bit, right? On the one hand, here comes all this money to our community, but there's a lot of trouble that comes with it.
And you mentioned the last person who saw Barbara was never interviewed by police, but before his death, was there any statement or any account of what he saw that night?
There was something that I discovered, you might say. So first of all, I had to search for this guy's name on my own. Williston PD did not give me this name. I had to work off of the fact that I received knowledge from one of Barbara's siblings who had heard from police that I think his first name was Stacy. I did email one of the detectives at Williston PD once I found this individual. I had to go through newspapers.com searching suicide 1981 Stacy, Montana, until I finally found an article. I asked Williston PD to confirm, so I wouldn't be talking on the podcast in the chance that there were two Stacys that committed suicide in 1981, trying to fact check things. Got no response. So I tracked down this guy's sisters in Northern California, actually up in Wairika, and spoke to the sisters. And they confirmed that it was their brother because one of the sisters said, well, when I got your email, I figured you were either an old friend of my brother's or this has something to do with Barbara Cotton. So they knew that their brother had this association with this girl that is missing. And then in my episode 5, I interviewed both sisters, and they are confident that their brother was he was definitely, according to them, capable of murder. They had some really frightening stories to tell of their own. My whole listener, everyone heard this on episode 5. And then the next episode was this interview with Williston PD. And really the only thing I wanted to, not the only thing, but the main point I wanted to ask them was this Stacy Werder somehow cleared at some point? Because I have two sisters saying he was a bad dude, and we've always thought he had something to do with Barbara's disappearance. Well, first of all, I should add, those two sisters were never spoken to by any law enforcement either. I was the first person to talk to them about this.
Well, I find that unbelievable, and not saying that someone's lying, but I find it kind of crazy that that two sisters of this, I guess you can call him a person of interest, Stacy Warder.
He was.
Two sisters feel this way. Do you know what he was in prison for when he committed suicide?
Yeah, it was a small thing. He like disorderly conduct, I think, something like that. And their sister said he had mental issues. He was kind of a drifter. I mean, according to the younger sister, they once burned their house down in California when they were kids, and a lot of other stuff that I don't even really want to talk about.
So for 30 years, these two sisters were waiting for a call about Barbara Cotton, and you were that call?
40 years, yeah.
40 years.
And so here's the interesting thing. You guys know about Team Adam? Detectives, I think retired detectives who, pro bono retired detectives. My understanding is that, well, more kind of interesting information that reflects on the, I guess the power of a podcast sometimes. Barbara's best friend, childhood friend, has been trying to find answers her whole life, off and on. And 10 years ago, she managed to get the Williston newspaper to print an article. And then I come along 10 years after that. I was asking for answers to questions from Williston PD for weeks and weeks before the podcast came out. Barbara's childhood friend, Sandy Evanson, had been trying to get in return. She had returned a call, never heard anything, and was very frustrated. And then after episode 3 of my podcast came out, I got two emails from the PD. She got a call. Barbara's sister got a call. I mean, it happened immediately. And I mean, that's cool, but it's also a little bit frustrating that it takes someone, annoying guy like me with a microphone, for that to sort of take place, right? But when you're ready for it, there's actually 2 persons of interest who hung themselves in jail.
Let's talk about that in a second. I want to back up a little bit just to the time that she disappeared. She's 15 years old, in this small city, large town, small city, and you described it a little bit like the Wild West, where there was some, with this type of industry comes a bit of trouble. Was she involved in any of this trouble? And the party that she was at, was this something where there was any sort of illicit drug use or alcohol consumption or anything sordid of nature? Was she involved in any of that?
Yeah, so Barbara was starting to run a little bit, get into a little bit of trouble, I guess. She was arguing a lot with her mother. Basically, Barbara wanted to move out of her house, which added to the fact that law enforcement originally thought she was a runaway, right? So there were a lot of arguments in the home, and Barbara was starting to, I guess I don't know this for certain, but the party she was at, which I had to also track down, I mean, no one has heard of this party until I interviewed law enforcement. They did tell us that this unnamed friend said they saw her at a party, and Barbara's siblings had no idea about this. Barbara's friends, it's the first time anyone's heard about this party, but I did speak to the person who I believe was the host of the party, and yeah, lots of alcohol. And Barbara was, her behavior was she had risk factors, right? She walked by herself a lot. She trusted everyone. She's walking around at night in a city, like you said, where it's a little bit of a wild, wild west. So,
and is it your belief that what led to her disappearance was a result of anything that might have happened at the party? Maybe somebody had followed her, or am I getting ahead of some details?
We don't know. But there are other persons of interest I could tell you about. This other individual who actually did murder 2 people. In fact, if I say the name Andy Johnson, you recognize her. I know you guys have retweeted some of her stuff. She's an advocate for...
Oh, yeah. Andy, yep.
I had her on the podcast. Her childhood friend Penny Swanson was 12 years old, and another girl, Renee Davidson, 9 years old, when they were murdered in Rawlins, Wyoming. And that's how I got in touch with Andy, because the man who murdered these 2 girls, Frank De La Pena, was in Williston when Barbara went missing. So he is another person of interest. And he left Williston I believe, 3 weeks after Barbara went missing, and immediately drove to Rawlins and tried to abduct several women, and finally did manage to abduct these 2 young girls in Rawlins and murdered them the same night. So another strong person of interest, right? This guy gets arrested promptly, hangs himself in jail, just like Stacy Werder will do 2 months later.
Okay, so now we have 2. You were just about to say, I think the same thing I'm going to say. 2 people that are very closely related and possible suspects who hang themselves. They're arrested and then they hang themselves within a few weeks of each other?
Yeah, so Frank hung himself in late May, about 1 month after Barbara went missing. Stacy Werder hangs himself 2 months later in Montana. And the connections I do have with these guys, potential connections, are they both worked in the oil industry. Aside from that thing they have in common, that they hung themselves in jail within 3-month period of each other, they both were in Williston when Barbara disappeared. Stacy was seen with her that night. Frank was not, but Frank did kill 2 girls 3 weeks later. What do you guys think? Is that a coincidence?
I mean, I think all of these cases, any unsolved missing persons case or unsolved murder, you're going to find more than one viable person of interest, at least character-wise, who was in the area at the time. I would absolutely focus more on Stacy, though, seeing that he was seen with him, with Barbara that night.
Right, and I am doing that. I just sent out technically, I'm petitioning the courts in Montana to get his autopsy inquest. So there was an autopsy inquest done, and I've learned through, well, you guys know how this goes. A little bird told me there's photographs in that file. Unfortunately, when he's deceased, but it would be the closest. It's not something I would ever publish, but it would be the closest to us getting to know what Stacy looked like at the time of his death, because we don't have a lot of photographs of him. And another interesting thing to add is pretty much nobody, until some people I spoke with too recently, very few people, except, so Barbara's mother said she saw Barbara with Stacy the night she disappeared. And she kept referring to this guy as her boyfriend. None of her friends, no one else knows about this guy. So it must have been, I'm pretty sure she had just met Stacy.
Going back to these 2 men who hung themselves, has there been anything beyond what you have discovered? Maybe people telling you about other disappearances, other murders that were in the area prior or just after? Because you discovered that, or you found out that one of them had been arrested for kidnapping, and was it attempted murder or an actual murder?
Frank De La Pena killed 2 girls in Rawlins. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. So aside from that, is there anything else that you've looked at that's maybe sort of adjacent to these crimes, like some unsolved murders or disappearances around that time? Because I feel like you're on the heels of like a potential serial killer.
No, I have not had a lot of time, but I will tell anyone else listening. So I just got some bad news last week. You know, the state of Wyoming have been fantastic with my open records request. Our hope was that, because the state crime lab processed his van, Frank's van, where the murders took place, and trailer. And, you know, we were like, please tell us that Montana kept forensic evidence from that. And they looked, and they really did. They did a great job. And, they were themselves like, we're just so sorry. We don't know. We don't have it anymore. And even worse, there's no photographs either. But I agree with you. This guy could have killed other people.
James, what's your background? I'm just curious how you got into this this case and podcast.
Oddly, I studied photojournalism and English in college, and then I never worked with it at all. I moved to Sweden. I worked in web development and database development over 20 years, and I came back. I was doing that here in North Dakota, and I started on the podcast about 3 years ago as a reaction to not exactly fake news, but even just the untruth, like barstool stories I've been hearing, the way people have taken Facebook to somehow be news. I don't know. I got in this situation where I just wanted to look at one story my first season and I guess focus on facts and critical thinking and can we find the truth? Can one person find the truth? And kind of wanted to demonstrate to others, like, you can do this, like anyone, not anyone, but it's a lot of hard work, but ask more questions, you'll get more truth usually. But so I finally, I guess, dumped my IT career for now and the good money that went with it to do something I'm very passionate about.
It's really commendable because what you're doing is something that you said it at the beginning of this, no one has done in 40 years now, over 40 years. So it has to be something really interesting to reprogram your brain or reprogram the way you're thinking career-wise to jump into something with no conclusion, because I can imagine being someone I'm not in IT, but I can imagine somebody in IT having a definitive result. Like, you do this and this happens. It must be endlessly frustrating to do something on one end of the equation and not see the result, especially when you're talking about people who you mentioned critical thinking, and you'd like to see more critical thinking. This must be loaded with non-critical thinking people if nothing's happened in 40 years. So is this frustrating to you? And how does your passion overcome that frustration?
Yeah, it gets frustrating. You get a lot of, I'm sure you guys got as well, a lot of leads from listeners, and you want to look at all of them. And some are great tips, and some seem like you can't even quite connect the dots yourself. How did this person come up with this theory? And I would say with this season with Barbara Cotton, the most frustrating thing was that somehow it was quite obvious that, I say we at this point, it's my podcast, but I have this great following, and it's sort of almost a mini movement that started for Barbara. We're not, as I listened to your podcast recently about your new show, A Few Bad Apples with Catherine.
Great show. And
she kind of brought this up too about, I'm not anti-police. I'm just asking questions about, why wasn't this person spoken to? You don't have to immediately go, well, we're not here to bad mouth the investigators back then. We're like, no, we're not here for that reason either. We're trying to find answers to what happened to Barbara Cotton. So that part gets frustrating.
And do you find that you hit a lot of roadblocks when people will automatically assume that your intention is to just exploit bad investigations or mistakes that police have made, when I think acknowledging the mistakes is more important, just because then you can move on, but you're not trying to exploit those mistakes. Do people get that confused?
I think so. And, I haven't had a lot of criticism. I should say, people who really want to know what happened to Barbara understand that, okay, in order to sort of reignite this investigation, we still have to understand what happened in the beginning. I mean, there could be very important information by knowing what was not done, right? But as I told a friend of mine who is in law enforcement, not in Williston, that I said to him, in your career, I bet you had to arrest a lot of people that you didn't want to arrest, because you liked them. You were rooting for them, right? I feel the same way when it comes to criticism towards law enforcement. I got an email from a listener who said, I guess I'll reach out to you, Mr. Wolner. Like, I'm not Mr. Wolner, call me James. But, he says, I left a tip with Williston PD 3 weeks ago, after a lot of discussions with my family. Something happened in our family 11 days before Barbara went missing, 3 blocks from where she went missing. We finally decided, we're going to leave this tip. And took a lot of courage, and I have not heard a single word after leaving a voicemail and sending an email. So my point with my friend who's a cop who had to arrest people that he didn't want to arrest, this is something I don't want to hear. I don't want to have to tell people that this guy didn't get a... I don't want to tell this, but then I'm in the situation where, well, I have to. It's been 3 weeks. He's not even got a confirmation that they got his email. So I put it on the podcast, called up the head of investigations there, got a comment from him. He says, that's not acceptable. And then he got a response within 5 hours. But I don't enjoy it. I don't want to tell that story. I want to find out what happened to Barbara.
But I guess the case is that you have to do something like that because it's inevitable when you're looking at something that's been unsolved for so long. The only way to get to these answers would be through something that you don't really enjoy doing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the story. I can't just ignore it because people are uncomfortable with people criticizing law enforcement. I mean, that can't be the way our society works. And, I listened also to your Justice for Jacob with Eric Carter Landine, True Consequences. He also talked about that when they did that 10 Days for Jacob, I think it was called, and campaign. And he was also didn't enjoy doing that, but he had not heard anything for so many months. It wasn't something he did to criticize them. It's just he's trying to get a response, and it worked, right?
Tell us about the state of the case, I guess. Has Barbara been legally declared deceased?
Yes, she was in 1998, and my feeling on that is that her mother was getting close to the end of her life. She died in 2004. Her son, Barbara's older brother, Frank, died in 1998. Her brother Frank is also a person of interest, according to Williston PD. They told us that. And so just before he died, Louise Cotton, Barbara's mother, had her daughter legally declared deceased. And interestingly, there's a headstone in North Dakota where Frank is buried. It's a double headstone, and it has Frank's name on one side and Barbara's on the other, and it just says missing at the bottom. So it's a little interesting, or whatever word you would use, that she's buried. Well, she's not buried there. It's just a name on a headstone next to her brother, who Williston PD say is a person of interest also.
Was he at the party that night?
Not to my knowledge, no. But Stacy Werder, I believe, was. And the state of the case, I guess, is they say it's open and ongoing. Have you guys had any experience with open and ongoing cases where the victim is legally declared deceased? And has it affected the open records laws in any way that you know of?
I think it's supposed to get you additional files and paperwork or access to those investigatory files. But no, I don't think from experience we've ever had that situation.
Yeah, it makes for an interesting discussion because, I'm in contact with other people who a son of a missing man here in North Dakota. He told me that law enforcement told him if they ever had him his father legally declared legally deceased, that they would have to shut down the investigation. But Williston PD has said they will never shut down this investigation. And another thing I'll throw out there is that in my interview with Williston PD, she did tell us that the record keeping, the documents are really sketchy until about 1985, 4 years after Barbara goes missing. And I've been assuming it's, sloppy work. Things were not documented enough.
When you say that the record keeping was sketchy, are you talking about, like you said, missing documents, or is it a combination of missing documents and just poorly drafted reports of the incident?
I can't say with any confidence because I've not seen the file myself. But I do know that Williston PD has told me in the interview that they have just boxes and boxes and boxes of information, and as some sort of indication what a big investigation was done. And yet none of that stuff contains the stuff we really need, like the interview with Stacy Werder, if it ever happened, or this unnamed friend who saw her at a party. And so it was kind of like they were saying, at the one hand, we've got all this stuff, but we don't have the stuff you're asking for, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just become kind of frustrating.
And are you still working with law enforcement?
I just sent a follow-up tip to Detective Derry a few minutes ago. I sent him a tip last week, and he responded right away, and he said he found it interesting, and I just followed up with another one. I just told my listeners in my last episode that there's something that unfortunately I can't talk about. You get to this point where, and I told my listeners, I'm so sorry I can't tell you more about this. You followed along with me all this way, and now I have this tip, I guess, for Williston PD, and I just can't tell you. It's so frustrating as a podcaster. You feel like you're letting your audience down, right? But I just cannot reveal. But basically what I told them was, I don't feel like I have the key to this story, but I think I know where there is which lock they need to unlock. If law enforcement can find their own key or pick that lock, that's a better way of saying it. If they can pick that lock, we might get some answers.
Are you this close or this in the weeds with any other disappearance or missing person or unsolved case, whether it's something that you've covered or you plan on covering, or is this about as deep as you've gotten?
This is probably the deepest I've gotten. And in fact, my earlier seasons were not all unsolved cases. I did a couple documentary style things about resolved cases, but I think my future is about, missing persons. Someone asked me about 12 years ago, I was just thinking about the other day, you get that question, if you became independently wealthy, what would you do? That whole question. And my answer was, I think I'd start some kind of company or organization to help families find their missing family members. And that was like 12 years ago. So I guess it's always been in here. And with this season, I'd kind of like to stick on this topic or whatever you want to call it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work and keep us in the loop on any case developments as the podcast moves along.
I sure will. And I cannot thank you guys enough for having me on. This was a big day for me. I've told a lot of friends. You guys have done fantastic work, and a lot of people I know listen to you. I remember listening to you guys started on an airplane about 4 years ago, and got hooked right away. So congrats to all your great work.
Oh, thank you so much. And same to you, to echo what Tim was saying. This isn't like you're seeing right now. Like, it's not easy. There's not a lot of money involved in it, and it's 100% passion. And when you speak about this, you can hear it. And if there's anything else that we can do for you, any way we can, other than spreading the word with this episode and with Barbara's story, let us know. The work that you have right now, there's a petition out there, right, that to sign. If you want to give that information, that'd be great.
We went with change.org. First time I did a change.org petition. And, I thought, we're up in rural North Dakota. I have a good following, but I thought if we get 1,000 signatures, that'll be cool. And then we got 2, and we're at 3,200 now. So, and the policymakers or change makers is the chief of police of Williston and one of the city council members. So they get emails, when we hit 3,000, I'm sure they got an email again like, hey, we're still here. And it can be found at change.org simply by searching Barbara Cotton. Or you could find it from my Facebook group or dakotaspotlight.com. There's a link from there as well. And yeah, I'd greatly appreciate some more signatures there on that petition. And the petition basically states, we're just trying to encourage Williston PD to put dedicated resources on Barbara's case for a certain time.